Theodore, and I'm an ecological restoration technician. So I graduated from BCIT with my bachelor's in ecological restoration. Ecological restoration is a specialized branch of ecology where we attempt to restore or fix degraded ecosystems in the hopes that it will speed up their recovery from damage, most often caused by humans. I've been working in the field for about 4 years now, and that's not including my other jobs where I worked at salmon hatcheries on the coast, giving out tours in the interior, and other similar jobs in my past. I'm working with Ecological in the Lower Mainland, and we are working to restore a lot of the green spaces around here that have sadly been neglected over time. So, we're going to be checking out clips from my favorite game of all time, The Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim. And I do have a lot of mods installed, so it might look a little different. So, let's start. Alright, so let's pause real quick. The obvious question is, what is an ecosystem? Well, an ecosystem is a population or community of species and organisms that live and interact with each other and their environment. Typically, these are classified along major climatic or flora differences. So obviously a desert is completely different from a rainforest, and as a result, you'd expect to find different species there. Now the question is, does Skyrim have ecosystems? Well, yeah, it does. They're very simple, and they're not very detailed, but they do exist, and they do have some of the interactions I would expect to find in an ecosystem like what I would find here on the coast. Now, of course, these are mostly for immersion. A lot of the actual ecosystem interactions I would expect to see are hidden from sight or simply don't exist in the game's code. And you know what? That's fine. You don't always expect to see these things, and when you're running around hunting down bandits and finding loot, you're not really paying attention to a lot of those interactions.
You hear me?
So Skyrim's got some really nice diversity in its ecosystems. I would actually almost call these similar to our Biogeoclimatic Zones here in British Columbia. BC Biogeoclimatic Zones, or Biological Geological Climatic Zones, are regional zones in BC, adopted by the BC Ministry of Forests based on the classification system that uses climax vegetation, that is to say, end-stage vegetation for a certain area, to estimate the annual effects of climate and soil, and how the ecosystem adapts to those conditions. Here in BC, there are 14 biogeoclimatic zones. That includes things like SWB, or the Spruce Willow Birch Biogeoclimatic Zone, or the most common one on the coast where I live is the CWH, or the Coastal Western Hemlock Zone. So Skyrim, even though there's no classification system of these ecozones in the game, actually would be pretty easy to divide. Most of the holds have very different environments from each other. There's some nice consistency within the holds themselves, but there's also nice diversity between the various holds in Skyrim. If I had to make up some biogeoclimatic zones for Skyrim, I'd say, I don't know, the Reach is mountain juniper, or mountain whatever that dead tree you see around the Reach is. Maybe Riften and the areas in the Rift would be something like interior aspen zone, or something like that. Whiterun might be tundra cotton. I don't know. There's no official classification system in Skyrim, but you probably could make one if you really wanted to. Okay, so I do have to point out that the tundra cotton in Skyrim does remind me a lot of a grass species that occurs in bogs called tawny cottongrass. And I love this grass. It just looks really, I don't know why I'm obsessed with this grass, but I love it. That's one thing I really like about Skyrim. It has a huge diversity of varying ecosystems within the game, but they're all a take or a different aspect of Arctic environments. You've got high Arctic ice fields out in Winterhold, and then you've also got the aspen forests, as we mentioned, out in Riften. So there really is a huge variety in the ecosystems within the game, and I really appreciate that. So digging down a little bit further into the different ecosystems, There's some pretty good distribution of the flora in Skyrim. You know, you'll see a variety of species all within the same ecosystems in Skyrim, but you'll also see them crossing over to other ecosystems as well. Of course, the dungeons are sort of an ecosystem unto themselves. I wouldn't even know what to call Blackreach, to be honest, but it's really cool. It's interesting to see an ecosystem largely devoid of sunlight. They do exist, though they're very rare in real life. Outside of a few cave systems, or really here on the coast in BC, we don't have much limestone, so most of our caves are really just fallen rocks that have fallen conveniently on top of each other. But I mean, they do exist, you know? Bats on the coast in BC would certainly be using caves when they can, although typically in areas where there's larger trees, especially Douglas firs, they tend to roost in the giant furrows or crevices in the bark of Douglas fir. Not that there's a huge amount of large fir trees around anymore, but we'll talk about that a little later. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that Skyrim does tend to have a pretty sparse understory, that is to say, smaller plants within a forest, you know, like shrubs rather than just trees. Typically, in a properly natural system, at least here, where I'm from, you expect to see a lot of ground being covered by shrubs and smaller plants. Skyrim, there's a lot of open space, which leads me to believe that a lot of people walk through the woods in Skyrim, which, given all the bandits, I'm not too surprised. So moving on to the forests in Skyrim. I think everyone who's played the game knows that Skyrim has a huge logging industry. I mean, there's sawmills in pretty much every hold. So you do expect a lot of the trees to be much younger in Skyrim, but I'm actually convinced that there's basically no old growth in Skyrim. So here in BC, we define old growth in two general categories, whether it's on the coast or in the interior. And they're different because of the climatic conditions. The coast is much wetter, much more temperate in its climate. The interior is a lot drier and a lot hotter. So on the coast, old growth is around 250 years old, whereas in the interior, it's about 140 years old. And I have seen some of the old growth trees on the coast, and they are beautiful. I mean, they are massive, and some of them have been living for literally hundreds, even over 1,000 years old. I visited the ones on Vancouver Island and Cathedral Grove. They can live and grow to be absolutely massive. And that's one thing that's missing from Skyrim. I think every hold in Skyrim has been pretty much clear-cut logged the entire way, because none of these trees would take more than 2 to 3 people to, you know, wrap their arms around the circumference of the tree. So I would definitely classify most of Skyrim's, if not all of Skyrim's forests, as secondary growth, which is, you know, smaller trees that haven't quite reached that mature age of 140, 250 years old. Now, it also depends on the amount of rainfall. If you have a lot less rainfall, and you have a much colder climate, you expect the trees to be much smaller. Just think of, you know, the trees at the top of a very tall mountain. They're much thinner, they're much sparser, it's harder for them to survive up there. But in Skyrim, all of these trees are in the lowlands, and there's plenty of other vegetation growing around too, so that really tips me off to say that this has all been logged before. Though, funny enough, even though I know there's plenty of logging going around, there's relatively few stumps laying around. Typically, if you travel through a forest here in BC, you see a lot of old tree stumps, especially cedars, and you can tell they were cut because they're all cut at the same height, and they've all got these little inserts for basically the wooden planks for the old loggers to stand on. But you don't see any of that in Skyrim. You see a handful of them over by the sawmills, but other than that, it's... I don't know, maybe the Nords just have some sort of technology that allows them to really easily rip up tree roots and get rid of all the stumps. Then again, they do have magic in Skyrim. Then again, they're the Nords, they don't like magic at all. One thing I do find pretty lacking from Skyrim is a lot of pollinators. I know there's like the meaderies that use honey for their mead, but that's still not quite enough pollinators. I expect to see fields of bees and butterflies and other birds and stuff, and yet there's none of that. There's no hummingbirds in Skyrim, which are a huge pollinator in our world. There's maybe some bats, but you never really see them unless vampires around, so I don't know how all these fields get pollinated, to be. Something that is a much bigger problem in Skyrim is monocultures. A monoculture is essentially when you have one species dominating either the entire ecosystem or a certain trophic level of an ecosystem. So let's say you have a forest, and if you only have one species of trees, let's say they're all pine trees, then you have a monoculture. And that is susceptible to a lot of problems. Number one, diseases. If every tree species is the same, then any disease that affects one tree will affect all of the trees. So that's on the species level. On the ecosystem level, if all of these trees are susceptible to the same disease, and they all die from the same disease, well then your entire forest ceases to exist. This is why ecologists often advocate for diversity in species. Within what the local ecosystems already feature. But the idea is, if you have, let's say again a forest, but you have a variety of species. You have 2 different kind of pine trees. You have a fir tree. You have a spruce tree. If there's a disease that comes through and wipes out one of those tree species, the others can still survive, and the forest will continue to exist. Whereas in the monoculture, everything's the same, and one thing affects all of them, then the forest is gone. And we have seen cases like that in real life. In BC, we have a specific pine tree called lodgepole pine. Typically, it's harvested in the interior of the province, and when they reforested these areas, they reforested them all with only lodgepole pines, because those were the most valuable trees. They grew the straightest and made the best, housing building trees. Unfortunately, they are susceptible to a pest known as mountain pine beetle. And when you replant a bunch of forests with only one type of tree, you create a monoculture, and that pest had a heyday when warm enough summers came, and they swept up from the north, had a huge population boom, and absolutely decimated all of the pine forests in the interior. And as a result, a lot of forests died, and even worse is that it caused perfect conditions for a lot more forest fires, which we've seen in years since. So typically, planting monocultures is not a good strategy if you're trying, even if you're just trying to harvest the trees, not a good strategy. And as an ecologist, never do that. I deal with enough monocultures in my job dealing with bramble bushes of Himalayan blackberry. That stuff will take over. But I'll save the invasive species talk for a different episode. And Skyrim really does have a monoculture problem, because you look at the forests in each of the different holds, and there might be different tree species in all of the different holds, but within the holds themselves, there's usually only one type of tree. Even in the old forests of Falkreath, there seems to really be only one type of, I think it's a hemlock tree or something approximating a hemlock. Maybe there's a few cedars with the flared out stems, but otherwise, the rift all has, juniper shrubs and those twisty, spindly dead trees. The rift seems to only have these really cool birches and or alpines. Just can't quite tell. Even texture mods can't help me with that. So Skyrim really does have a monoculture problem, and I wonder if that's related to their logging industry. Okay, so, you want to know what my favorite location in Skyrim is? There's one specific dungeon in Skyrim. I don't know if it was intentional or if it was unintentional, but I think it actually has a really good representation of a trophic system. A simplistic one, but one nonetheless. It's Shadow Green Cavern, close to Solitude. Now, besides being a really beautiful dungeon, cave with skylight, looks really cool, if you look at how it's structured, it seems to represent a trophic system, or a food chain. At the lower levels, you've got the grasses, plants, shrubs, and you've got a bunch of wild rabbits running around. Then, as you go up this center spire in the cavern, you've got the wolves that hunt the rabbits. And then as you go up to the last, third level, you encounter bears, which wouldn't really hunt wolves, but they would scavenge the carcasses if the wolves were to die. And then you've got spriggans. I'm not really sure where they fall into the trophic system, but I'll safely assume that they're at the top. So it's a really cool little detail, and again, I don't know if the level designer intended this to be a trophic system or a representation of one, but as an ecologist, I looked at this and I couldn't help but thinking, hey, this is literally just a food pyramid or a food chain in actual, like, physical form. And I thought that was really neat. Plus, it doesn't hurt, it had some nice loot at the top. Even with my small ecological gripes on it, Skyrim still is one of my favorite games of all time. It's probably my favorite game ever. I've spent countless hours wandering around, and I'll probably spend countless more wandering around as well, as long as the modders keep making more mods for it. The ecology in Skyrim does hold up to a point, but once you start to look a little deeper, you see that it's a lot of it's kind of just surface level ecology. Deeper down, it could use a bit more complexity. I'll wait for the modders to take care of that. So, thank you all for watching. This has been an Ecologist Reacts to Skyrim. If you'd like to see more of these types of videos, leave a comment down below, like, share, and subscribe. We will definitely release more of these if there is enough interest. And if you want to check out some of the work we've done here at Ecological, please go and check out our YouTube channel and see some of our other restoration projects that we worked on. Anyways, I've been Theo, I'll catch you later, and thanks for watching.